Namaste. Welcome to everyone that's tuned in today. This is the fourth in the web series called The Future We Want, presented by Initiatives of Change India. This session is being broadcast on Facebook as well as YouTube. So if you have trouble with one, feel free to switch over to the other one. And the links are in the live chat. My name is Aparna, but of course, the person you're here to listen to is Kalpana Sharma. This is a 45-minute session today, and after Kalpana ji speaks, there will be a time for question and answers. So during the session, feel free to post your questions in the chat window on Facebook or YouTube, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. So most of us are tuning in from home in lockdown or confinement with this incredible situation that this tiny new virus has created. Many people are talking about COVID khatam hone ke baad, or the new normal, or the new world after COVID, and so on. So I'm happy that today's subject is a wish list for a post-COVID world. And who better to talk about this than someone who will tell it to us exactly as it is. It is my great pleasure and honor to host today Kalpana Sharma. Some of you may know her. For those that don't, Kalpana Sharma is an independent journalist and author. As she has been at it for almost 50 years now. She's based in Bombay, but she's widely through the world, taught at universities, including Berkeley, and edited and written several books. But as she says, journalism is very much her passion. It is what she has invested in and what she loves. She has worked with the Himmat Weekly, Indian Express, the Times of India, and the Hindu. She was also consulting editor with Economic and Political Weekly and readers editor with Scroll In. Starting out as a journalist, she made a conscious choice to tackle topics around developmental and environmental issues and gender. And I think this is what sets her apart from a lot of other journalists, that at the outset, she consciously chose these subjects, which are not the most popular in journalism. But she identified very clearly with issues to do with human rights and women's rights, and felt the need to bring out truths on these topics through her writing and through working with groups challenging those in power. It often meant sticking her neck out and going against the flow, as she describes it. And yet she persevered with great energy and passion to the benefit of us all. I am very inspired by Kalpana ji, for hers is a journalism of courage displayed throughout her career, including with her courageous stand during the emergency, which she talked about yesterday, while she was editor of the Himmat Weekly. That courage continues in her writing today. As I said, she's also done several books. She has been an editor on several, but has also written 2 books of her own, which deserve a look. Her books are, one is called Rediscovering Dharavi, Stories from Asia's Largest Slum, which talks about urban poverty and the place of the poor through the lives of the people. And the second, The Silence of the Storm, talks about the various aspects affecting violence against women, including development policy, environmental aspects, and so on. I'm very pleased that you agreed to speak with us today, Kalpana ji, on a wish list for a post-COVID world. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Aparna, and hello, everyone. This is one of the things about this pandemic and COVID crisis and working from home is that you end up talking a lot to the computer and the computer screen and not to actual human beings. It would be wonderful if I could see all your faces and actually know who I'm speaking to. But I trust that you can actually see and hear me and that we can actually have an interaction. So as Aparna said, I'm a journalist, so I'm in the business of following whatever is the current issue. And at the moment, of course, we can talk of nothing else but this pandemic. And yet, because you're locked in, you also have the time to not just read about it and think about it, but also think of other issues. So the last 3 months of being locked into this apartment that I live in Bombay, when normally I would have actually stepped out and tried to assess for myself the impact of this pandemic on people, has made me really think about what this is showing up about our society and what needs to be done if we really want to bring a change because of the fact that it's shown up something. So that's the reason I chose this subject, because I think many of you also, like me, may have felt that, what of the future? First of all, when will it ever end? None of us knows. And when and if it does, and it will, um, what then? Are we going to go back to business as usual, or are there going to be some changes? So one thing is true, that this is a strange pandemic. I mean, there have been other epidemics before. There's been the plague. There's been lots of other things. There's been SARS, there's been MERS, all these other kind of things. But this is one that has literally affected the whole world. And it's a kind of enemy that we can't see. It's something that invades us. It doesn't discriminate against your nationality. It doesn't discriminate against religion or caste or age or race or gender or creed. Um, and given that this is the way this COVID-19 is all about, you would have thought that it would actually bring all our societies together, and within our societies, that we would all rally together because of the fact that we are all going to be affected, and by this one way or the other. But the odd thing, of course, is we've seen it not just in India but elsewhere, that barring the fact that there have been some very brave individuals who have gone out and tried to do their best to help in terms of providing medical help or helping those in distress, by and large, my observation is that the fault lines that are there in our societies have remained intact. And if anything, they've become worse. They've become more exaggerated. Sometimes at a time of crisis, you either heal those, or you render them, they get exacerbated or get bigger. And this is observation. People can disagree with it. But one of the things that really um, is a symbol of our Indian society is the extent of inequality or inequity. So in the last years, with the changes in the economy, globalization, India has become more prosperous, or so it seems. Our growth rate has been enviable compared to many other countries. But the other thing that has been very noticeable is that at the same time, there's been much greater equality. The gap between the people who've done well for themselves, these changes in the economy, and the people at the very bottom has actually grown much bigger. And that is something that should be unacceptable. But we have just sat quiet and accepted it as a society. And Thomas Piketty, who is this well-known economist, calls this kind of inequity, he calls it the violence of inequity. And to me, that's a very interesting turn of phrase, because when I think of the last months, especially since March 24th, when the national lockdown was announced with only 4 hours notice, what is the image that comes to us most? The image that has hit us most is this vast exodus of men, women, and children leaving our cities. They were given 4 hours notice. These are people who live on daily wages, and overnight they were left with no jobs, often with no shelter, no food. The trains were stopped, the buses were stopped. There was no way for them to get back to their own homes. And so many of them just set out from the cities. They started walking. And all those images, all of you must have seen on television, not so much on television actually, but at least in the newspapers and on social media. I mean, really, they're heart-rending, all of them. So many of them are still so vivid in my mind. The feet of many of these people who wore very flimsy chappals, which gave way after a few kilometers. Uh, Old people carrying loads, children being carried by their fathers and their mothers, crying inconsolably for food. And the worst was the way many of them almost reached and then died before they could get there. And there's that terrible image that all of you must have seen of the little child trying to pull the cover from her mother, who's lying at Muzaffarabad railway station. She died before they could reach home. And this was played over and over again, this video all over. And it really, to me, symbolizes the tragedy of what was happening. So it is, to me, it is a form of violence that we have to acknowledge, that these are the people, actually, these men, women were the ones who, as I say, they service our cities, they build our cities. And they're part of, in the Indian economy, the largest number of people are involved in what is called the informal economy. And most of these people who left were daily wagers. So they would come to the city for some, maybe a few years or a few months, and then they would want to go back home when they did not have either enough money or they had enough money to go back and say be there for harvesting. But this was a schedule that they had not planned, and it was suddenly landed on them. And with the construction industry closed, with all other industries closed, textiles, all the informal industries, they were left with nothing. And so they were forced to leave. So I think this is something we have to mark as something about our society that must change in the future. We can't just accept that this is the way things will be. And, it's made for many, in fact, for many middle class people, I must tell you, that they suddenly woke up to this reality that there are these millions of people who live in our cities, that they were literally invisible to them. And suddenly, smack, they come in your face because you see their pictures every single morning. And you realize, where were these people? How come we never saw them? How come they were invisible? So, this opening of your eyes ought to be something that should lead to further thought of what can be done. The other fault line, as I see it, is that of gender. Now, this is something I have written for 30, 35 years and studied. It's there. We all know it. We know that in our society, men and women are treated differently. Women are often given the second class status in so called normal times. But this time, one of the silent pandemics that is taking place at the same time as this COVID-19 pandemic is that of domestic violence. Now, I have argued that most people think of violence against women as the rapes that take place in the public space. So the 2012 gang rape, for instance, in Delhi was much talked about. But the much larger number of violent incidents against women actually take place within their homes and are a form of domestic violence. Now, try and imagine for 3 months, these women who suffer this kind of violence within their homes being literally locked into their homes with their abusers. This is actually what's happening. It's not just in India, it's all over the world. The WHO, the UN, all of them have talked about the silent pandemic and what can be done about it. So, some countries and some states within India, like Kerala, have made actually a great effort to try and reach out to these women and give helplines. But for the majority, actually, there's no option. They just can. How can they go out if they're locked in? And try and imagine what that does to the women who are caught in this. And the other thing we don't realize is, women anyway have, uh, they feel a sense of responsibility to run the family. So women are the ones who also feel that they must feed everybody first before they eat. They must look after everybody's health before they look at their own. And as a result of this, that many of these women, I'm talking about poor women particularly, have actually neglected their own health, their own nutrition, and the cost of this will be seen in times to come. I'll come back to that later. The third fault line, as I see it, is that of race, caste, and religion. And if I'm talking to an Indian audience, I really don't have to explain this. We might say we are not racist in India because, like they have in the West, for instance, or in the US right now, Black Lives Matter is going on. But I think actually we are a very racist society. And this has become evident right now with the way people from the Northeast have been treated. Just because this virus originated in China, anybody who looks Chinese is being picked upon. And you've all read about these terrible incidents of women being spat upon and kicked and people beaten up, landlords asking Northeasterners to leave. Uh, uh, so many of them have actually run away from the cities and gone back to their states, and I don't blame them. And this has happened very many times, just because they look different from what we consider the mainstream looks. And right now, as if any of you are following the newspapers, there's a big thing about this cream called Fair and Lovely, which is produced by Hindustan Unilever, and which is going to be, the name is going to be changed. But the point is that these whitening creams in India are a huge seller. And why? Why? Because we prefer white skin. So what is that? Is that not racism? So anybody who's dark complexion, then quite often that also is a denoter of caste. South India has many dark people too. Um, Actually talks about this incipient racism that is there. So racism and casteism often intersect. Um, so we have seen this exposed in the pandemic, and we have also seen religious bigotry. So we saw when that Tablighi Jamaat meeting took place in Delhi, and people from that dispersed to different parts of India, and there were an increase in the number of COVID cases as a result. All Muslims were immediately treated as if they're carriers of the coronavirus. There were even things on social media suggesting they were deliberately doing this. In my building where I live, there's somebody who put out a WhatsApp saying, "Don't buy from Muslims." I mean, this is a kind of deep rooted bigotry that is there, that came out during this time. And what is ironic is within days of the Tablighi Jamaat, there were at least two other huge religious meetings. And it's entirely possible that even from there the virus was spread, but there was no talk about that. So it's this deep rooted Islamophobia that came to the surface during this time. So I think this is another thing we need to confront. And coming back to caste, I find this is a subject we often skirt. We don't talk about it very clearly in many groups in India, except those who are obviously dealing with the issue of caste. And it's very interesting that when the term social distancing was brought in as a way in which we have to deal with this virus, it was the Dalits who brought up the fact that actually they have been victims of social distancing because of their caste. What is untouchability? That's what it is, social distancing. So I deliberately never use the word social distancing. I will say physical distancing, which is what it is. And I think all of us should think about that and do it. And at the same time, we must recognize that at this time, when the rest of us have been locked in, those of us who are a little more privileged, have food, have a roof over our heads, so there's really no suffering. The people who have kept our cities clean during this entire pandemic have been mainly Dalits. They are the ones who are employed in these jobs. And there's very little acknowledgement of what they go through, the fact that they are exposed to the disease in ways that it's not easy for them to deal with. So I think this targeting of people who we consider the other, whether they're of a different race or a different caste or a different religion, is a very, very deep fault line in our society. And I think it has to be acknowledged and addressed. So, I mean, this is a huge subject. We can talk about it for hours. But there are two or three things I'd like to say. One is that, at one level, of course, I do believe it needs systemic changes to deal with some of these. I mean, like the issue of inequality has to do with economic laws, with other laws in this country, with policies, development policies that acknowledge that there is inequity and find ways to deal with it. So maybe as an ordinary person, I might say, there's nothing I can do. But I do believe there is something that we as individuals can do. Um, One of the things, of course, is to accept that this ought not to be the state of affairs in the country. It's so easy to become casual, to become complacent if you are better off and forget the suffering of others. This pandemic has forced us to look at the suffering of those who are not as privileged as us. So it ought to make us passionate to find ways to address this inequality. It ought to make us think, how can we bring in policies that respect the labor of the poor, that they are guaranteed decent living conditions and they're paid for the kind of work that they have to do. These are many questions, but I think these are questions that must be part of our conversation and discussion and cannot be left only to economists and policymakers. Ordinary people must feel agitated about it and must come up with ideas and ways to address it. Linked with the exodus of the workers from the cities has also been the state of our cities. I don't know how many of you live in big cities. I live in Bombay, and half the population in this city lives in slums, where there's not enough water, where the sanitation facilities are very poor. They live absolutely crammed into small rooms. So during this pandemic, one of the recommendations is that you have to have this physical distancing. You have to wash your hands frequently. And it's laughable because how can people who are living in these kind of conditions maintain that kind of either physical distance? When there's no water, how are you going to wash your hands frequently? When there are common toilets, how are you going to make sure that you are not exposed to these things? So I think this is one thing that we should think about again in terms of how our cities are organized. Um, and the other thing I've had to confront many times in these last months is the inability of, again, people of my class or the middle class to accept that actually it's people of our class who brought the virus in. Okay, we are the privileged who can travel abroad, and the first cases came from people who'd gone abroad and came back to India. And then it spread to the poor who are working in our homes, who then live in these slums. So in Bombay, for instance, at the moment, 57% of the containment zones, these are areas that are blocked off because of high incidence of the virus, are in slums. This is the consequence. And the death rate is much higher in these containment zones than in the rest of the city. And this is because the people who live there, they're already compromised. Their health is already compromised. They're open. I mean, we are coming into the monsoon. There's going to be malaria. There's going to be dengue. There's going to be gastroenteritis. There's going to be leptospirosis. All these diseases are perennial diseases from which the poor people suffer. On top of it, now we have this pandemic. And then you have the difficulty of getting healthcare. So try and imagine all these scenarios and how in future we have to deal with this. We can't just say, okay, this happened this time and maybe it won't happen the next time. It will. Because in fact, from all we know, there are going to be more of these pandemics. And we have to address housing and healthcare, water and sanitation. And in the past, for instance, again in the city of Bombay, when there was the bubonic plague, when the British was still here, there were many parts of the city that were reorganized. Streets were made broader, underground drains were laid, housing was done in such a way that it was decent, including for the poor. The famous chawls of Bombay were built at that time because there were no slums at that time. So why can we not use this crisis to again reorder our cities so the poor can live with dignity? We must also ensure that there is affordable health. I mean, that is the other big crisis that we are faced with in India. There are just not enough beds. The private sector is out of reach for poor people, even for many lower middle class people. And our public health system has been allowed to go into a state of neglect. And so at this time, it's a real crisis because we cannot isolate people, we cannot treat them. People have died waiting to get into a hospital, sitting in an auto rickshaw, waiting in a wheelchair outside a hospital. Should be unacceptable. The countries that have dealt best with this crisis are those that have affordable public health care. Just look around you. And even in India, the one state that has done well is Kerala, because Kerala has a decentralized healthcare system that was already in place before this. On the gender fault line, um, as I said, I don't think it will disappear overnight. But I think we have to look at gender as a part of an overall crisis. It's not something that you deal with every now and then. It's actually enmeshed in every crisis, whether it is a natural calamity, whether it's a pandemic of this kind, whether it's economic distress, there's always a gender aspect. So I think we should recognize that and find ways to deal with it. Okay, this is all very negative, I know. So what is the positive? So the positive is I look out of my window now and I can see the horizon because I have a little bit where I can see the sea. I live in Bombay. I grew up being able to see that, but not anymore, not for many, many years. And so that is a positive, that somehow air pollution has improved. But why? It's improved because we have all been forced off the streets. People like us who drive around in our fancy cars or on motorbikes or scooters or use, taxis. Public transport also been off the road, but public transport is actually clean because we have trains and we have CNG buses. So this ought to show us that, and nature has reasserted itself, by the way. Bombay is beautiful at this time. It is something that many people are like waking up to the fact that there is actually a lot of green in the city. We don't see it. And the funny thing is, in my own neighborhood where I live, people drive around in cars, they never walk, and they're forced to walk now. And suddenly they're discovering that they actually live in a beautiful neighborhood with lots of nature. There's bird song, the gulmohar trees are flowering, And these are all things that ought to be there. I mean, why should we have to have a pandemic for us to have to, discover all this? So what do I want for the future? So let me just give two or three things. One, as I said, that we acknowledge the invisible millions who toil to build the country and respect them enough to ensure that they do not suffer the hunger and the humiliation that they did in the last months. And I'll emphasize the humiliation because these are men and women who were working and earning. And many of them said they felt really humiliated. They had to literally beg for food, that they had to stand in line to get food. That we recognize that the violence within the four walls, the so called safe space, is the most important aspect of violence against women, and it needs to be addressed. And it's not just a question of law, it requires us to recognize that women are human beings, they're citizens, and they have the same rights as any man. This is a change in mindset that is required, not just a change in law. That we acknowledge that racism, casteism, and religion based discrimination are deeply embedded in our psyche in India. First, I believe the first step is to acknowledge it. And then the other step is to build on the solidarities. That means you reach out to the people who are at the receiving end of this discrimination and hatred, work with them to find ways to end it, and be ready to stand up and speak out when you see this. Don't just be indifferent and say this is the way it is. Speak out, confront it, say we will not accept this kind of discrimination. um, the other thing that has struck me apart from these three things is, this particular pandemic has really challenged us as individuals because, it has strained the health system, it has damaged the economy, but it has asked all of us to be responsible, okay? Because there's no cure. At the moment, there's no vaccine yet. It may take another 18 months. So, how are we going to ensure that the virus doesn't spread? It has fallen on the individual to take that responsibility. And, I think that's a very good thing because it says that you cannot blame somebody else. You must be responsible to make sure that you don't spread it to anywhere else. And that is a consideration that you have to have by wearing a mask in the public spaces and, making sure that you're not doing anything that endangers another life. The other thing I think it has forced us to accept is the dignity of labor. Now, Gandhiji has talked about it, but, it hasn't got through to the Indian mind, not to the middle class anyway. So, we take it for granted that we have people who come and clean our houses, cook for us. And many people have been now forced to do jhadu poncha and to cook and to wash their dishes and to hang out their clothes, iron their clothes, do everything. And I hope at the end of it, you understand the kind of work that people put to keep you free to do the things you feel you are entitled to do. And that we pay a decent wage to these people who look after us year in and year out. They are our real caregivers. They're our real support system. And yet many of us have never really appreciated enough. So my hope is that at the end of it, that those, especially the women who are working in our homes, will assert themselves because they'll realize that they have a chance now, and that people like us will also acknowledge it by paying them a decent wage for the kind of work they do. And about the clean air, which I said, it's wonderful, but it won't last long because it'll be business as usual. And already, even though they've said greenhouse gas levels have come down, they have again started rising. I think that again requires a personal decision that, that we decide to use public transport or fight for clean public transport in our cities, which will benefit the largest number rather than privatized transport, which adds to the pollution load. And this ought to be everybody's business. This is not just the work of environmentalists. And the other thing is to maintain green areas which are open to everybody. There's a tendency now for these gated communities that have green areas just for themselves. That is not going to save our cities. Our cities will be saved if the beaches, if the parks are open to everybody, and they're maintained by everybody, and that citizens play a role in making sure that these things are there. The lack of transport has also made many of us buy locally. Now, as an environmentalist, I know for years we've been saying this: buy local. Don't use a car to go a few kilometers to buy something when you can walk for 10 minutes to buy something. So this ought to become a norm now for the future, which will also help in curbing the extent of pollution. So, and there are many other things, and I'm sure some of you may have ideas of what are the kind of things that ought to be done. But in the short time, these are some of the things that I have thought about. I do believe these changes ought not to be temporary, but my fear is, given human nature, given our nature of our societies, that it will be. But I think if there are enough of us who keep talking about it, trying to find ways to push the envelope, to make sure that people remember this time, this crazy year of 2020, and the way it sounds, and what it has taught us, that maybe some of these changes we can actually bring about, both in the way we live and in our societies. So I'll stop there, Aparna. Look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Kalpana ji. I think like an artist would look at a painting, you've sort of brought out elements, textures, colors, which we wouldn't normally see. So thank you for doing that. The three fault lines which you talked about, and that ordinary people must continue to feel agitated and to push the envelope. So that's what I take away from it. I'm not going to spend time summarizing because there are people who want to ask questions.
Yeah.
But what I might suggest is that we just take a minute or couple of minutes just in silence for just to let that sink in for the audience. And then perhaps people can put in their questions and comments on Facebook or YouTube, and I'll relay them to you, and you can respond to the ones you'd like to. So my suggestion is also perhaps to one question which you alluded to, that what are we doing? What are we doing in response to changing the way we live? And is there something that we've been doing during the pandemic that we would like to continue, or that we should continue? Perhaps that's something that people could think about and respond on as well. Maybe that's something you'd be interested in. So let's take a couple of minutes just in silence, and then I'll open it up for questions. Okay. There's a comment and half a question from Keshav Dahal, who's from Nepal, living in Nepal at the moment. And I think this is an issue which he sees there. Great point made on domestic violence. It is a real issue in almost every home today, I would say. Thanks for the great thoughts. Please give one or two suggestions towards awareness and resolution of domestic violence, starting from each home, each family itself.
There are many different strategies that women's groups in different countries have followed on domestic violence. As you know, one of them is that neighbors should intervene if you hear, and most of us in India live close enough to actually hear the distress of a woman. So rather than being indifferent and feeling, oh, I don't want to interfere, in fact, you need to interfere. Um, in India, at least, we have a law where you can actually go to the police if you know of a woman constantly being beaten up, and the police can actually go there and book the man. So I think those provisions have to be used. I think as far as cultural change is concerned, I really think it depends a lot also on the families and how we bring up our boys, you know. And I think boys who grow up seeing their mothers being beaten, and not a culture to accept that this is not the way things ought to be, are the ones who then go and beat their wives, They think this is the way things have to be. So I think within families this kind of change has to come in. And I would say that young men who are getting married today have to find a way to change this in their relationship with their spouses, make sure their children understand that it is not the right of a man to beat a woman. These are long term changes, but that's the only way this will happen, because just having a law and a deterrence is not enough. So I think it's a combination of those. And I think um, in some cities they have actually made these helplines available, but the helpline is not enough. I mean, in Bombay, for instance, there's a group that makes sure that there's also shelter available, you know so the woman can move out of the house where she's being abused if necessary. Because just her calling for help and then having to continue living in that situation is sometimes not enough if the man can't be got out for whatever reason. So it's a very complex societal issue, and as I said, it's worldwide. It's not just in India, and it has to do with misogyny is the word in English, but in this deep-seated anger and almost hatred of women that is makes men feel threatened by women who question. Quite often, it's a woman who questions who gets beaten up. Quite often, the man is frustrated about something else, and he takes it out on the woman because she's the easiest target. So there are many reasons for this, but that's why I said gender is just one of those deep-rooted things in our society that has to be acknowledged and tackled if we want justice in our society. We can't get it any other way unless we really confront this and deal with it.
Thank you, and appreciation to Keshav for the question. Um, Comment and question from Sakshi Gaithwas of Maharashtra. Thank you for acknowledging the kinds of discriminations, especially gender-based ones, and igniting the need for a positive change that needs to be done in this direction. I feel we need more women leaders to bring a positive change. The question is, how do we transform women, particularly young girls, into leaders and someone who don't become survivors anymore in this patriarchal setup? How do we create women leaders when patriarchy has affected everything in our society right from the start?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it'll remain a question for a little while. But I think what's happening is there are two or three things that you see. One is clearly education. I think the growth of increase in literacy amongst women, um, and amongst young girls particularly, has given them uh, much more confidence than they used to have before. And the second is economic independence. I think there's no shortcut to that. I think if women are able to earn, um, it gives them a voice. This thing about domestic work, for instance, in Bombay, there's this bai system. These women who come and work in several houses, and we don't realize how important that income is for them, because it gives them a voice in their own families, because they're bringing in this income, which may be part of family income. Maybe they can't decide how it should be used, but it gives them leverage, which is very important. So I think those two things, there's no question that they do make a difference in terms of what women can, in changing patriarchy. But patriarchy is a system that is not just within families. It's a system that you find in our places of work, where automatically, men are the bosses. Women really still have to struggle very hard to break that glass ceiling. Um, so I think, like all struggles, whether it has to do with color or caste, this is a struggle that has to continue. And I think it can't be done by an individual. I think it has to be done by a combination of people who get together, and women's groups across the world have fought on equality for a long time and have to continue to do so. It has to do with building, as I said, these solidarities. You have to find partners amongst men also who are sympathetic to this. And you have to fight for changes in structures, in the laws, in the manner in which laws are implemented. It can't be just me as an individual trying to change it. It has to be a combination of all these things. And I think the positive changes that have taken place, I mean, to me, the wonderful thing in India is how well girls are doing in sports. Think back, like 20 years ago, did we have such spectacular sports people like Mary Kom, and the others, and where have they come from? They've come from very ordinary backgrounds. They're not ones who belong to gyms and gymkhanas and clubs. So I think that we have to acknowledge it is changing, but of course not fast enough. Oh, and the third thing I must say is, which I've argued for a long time, the one thing on which, even if you're a qualified woman with great qualifications, most Indian women have no choice is on the issue of marriage. When it comes to marriage, somebody else decides for you who you should marry. I think that just undoes all the good that has been done by education or economic independence. That has to change. I mean, a woman is not a barter or object to be given from one family to the other. If you really respect women, respect the fact that they can also choose, and they can choose who they want to marry and when they want to marry and whether they want to marry. So I think that is another big change that has to come into our society.
Thank you. I think Sakshi's feeling a little bit of your passion. It's contagious, hopefully more than COVID is. Couple of comments, and then we have only about 4 minutes left, unfortunately. So maybe just one last question, which you could take briefly. Comment from Ilza Slanke from the US. Dear Kalpana, thank you for a very revealing and thought-provoking talk. Stay strong. Comment from Zareen Virji in Bombay. Let's end our sense of entitlement and give dignity to the invisible. Thank you, Kalpana Sharma. So a question from Aching R. Marak of the Northeast. Many people have returned home, leaving their job behind and to no means of livelihood at this point of time. What do you have to say about those individuals who need to get jobs and earn for family after coming back? And if government were to provide work for them, do you think we are prepared for that? Knowing that the future is uncertain and nobody knows when the situation is going to restore back. Please share your thoughts.
Thank you for that question. I think it's a very important one. Several of those who left the city are beginning to come back. In Bombay, for instance, we find that there are people coming back. I think for Northeasterners, it's a long journey they've made to go back home, and it will be very costly for them to come back unless the people who employed them pay for them to come back. And I'm sure they also fear that they might again face discrimination. I'm sure that's very deep-seated because that's happened not once, but several times. I'm not sure the governments in the Northeast are in a position to give jobs to everybody who's returned. Ideally, I think in terms of development, I think we have to find ways to create greater investment in the Northeast, so that the kind of jobs that Northeasterners are coming and doing here, they can also find ways in which they can do it in the Northeast. And these can be eco-friendly developments, because the Northeast is such a rich repository of biodiversity and beauty. And why not develop that? Some of that has already been developed in Nagaland, for instance, in Konama and other places. So I think there's a great potential there that ought to be developed, and that will give many more people in the Northeast ways in which they can continue to work in the Northeast without being displaced in this way, in this terrible way that they have been in the last months.
Mm-hmm. So Aching also says that there is also a one-stop center in every district, a helpline who works with women victims of crime and need to work in collaboration with them as well.
Yeah, very good.
So there are a few more questions and comments, but to be honest, it's end of this session for today. So I think there will be an opportunity for you to, Kalpanaji, respond by text to some of the questions or comments that are on YouTube and Facebook. So we'll try to get those to you. But just want to say a very big thank you to you for being on this session today. Wonderful to hear your thoughts, and it's certainly given us a lot of food for thought, but also I think a little bit of a challenge to take up the courage, some of which you've displayed throughout your life, and not just sit back, but actually think about how one can do something. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Aparna, for being a wonderful host.
Thank you. It's been easy talking with you. Thank you to the audience that have been such a great audience today for all your questions and comments. Wonderful to have you all here. Do follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel for updates about our next session, which will be in another couple of weeks, and other programs as well. Recordings will be available of this, and you may have noticed of previous sessions as well on the Initiatives of Change website. The link will be provided on the live chat. The next speaker slot will be announced soon. What I like to say just quickly is that I want to thank the technical team that has been behind all this. I mean, normally we take it for granted, but there's been a lot of testing and stuff that has been going on. So big thank you to them. And these are all volunteers that work with Initiatives of Change. So if any of you listening in would like to contribute anything to help with the work of Initiatives of Change and these sessions, please feel free to do so. The donation link will be on the live chat and the websites. So many thanks for this awesome session. I've enjoyed it very much and look forward to seeing you all next time.
Thank you.
Take care and bye-bye.
Bye.